Hello and welcome to the interview on France 24. I'm Robert Parsons, and our guest today is a man who for decades now has provided advice to presidents and prime ministers on issues of governance, peace and conflict. Sundeep Waslekar is the president and co-founder of the Mumbai-based Strategic Foresight Group, an international think tank on the global future that has worked with more than 60 countries. He's also the author of several books, including one in the Marathi language, which is now in its 22nd edition. Sundeep Waslekar, thank you very much for being on the interview with us. 22nd edition, that must be a record in India, isn't it?
Yes, indeed. At least in Marathi language, which is the language spoken by only 120 million people.
Only?
Only, yes, in Western India. I mean, by Indian standard, it's only. But it's a language rich with literature. And it's a book which is supposed to be holding a record for the last half century.
Okay, well, to get into the meat of our conversation today, I want to start by asking you about the Normandie Manifesto, which you and 5 others, including 3 Nobel Peace Prize winners, signed in June in a meeting to coincide with the D-Day anniversary. And you wrote, "Let us conceive and establish sustainable peace before someone initiates the next war. If we do not, we will be sleepwalking into collective suicide." It's a very tough message.
Absolutely, Robert. Since the end of the Cold War, the global military expenditure has doubled instead of reducing. The lethality of nuclear weapons has increased. And we have entered a post-nuclear era where we are using robotics, genomics, and artificial intelligence to produce new and new kinds of weapons. And we are now just at the stage, on the edge, where the decision-making for killing people and hitting targets would be passed on from human beings to machines through killer robots and hypersonic missiles. This is perhaps the most dangerous time in the history of human species.
Well, you call it an existential moment, and you also point out that it also occurs at a time when global powers are withdrawing from existing arms treaties and not moving to establish new ones. How dangerous is that?
Well, in addition to withdrawing from the existing arms treaties, there is a danger that the New START treaty, which is supposed to be up and running in 2021, may not come through at all. China has indicated that it will not get into the intermediate nuclear force agreement.
And the United States is just withdrawn from it.
The United States has withdrawn and Russia has withdrawn.
Yeah.
And besides that, there are no agreements at all on the post-nuclear weapons, such as the killer robots.
But how do you explain that? Why is it? Why isn't there sufficient responsibility at state level to recognize the importance of getting those treaties in place?
Well, partly because we are in an era of retreat of multilateralism. We are in an era of unending wars. And we are in an era of supranationalism or ultranationalism. And we have entered a period where the nationalism and selfish parochial interests and tribal interests are supposed to be superior to our common future.
You mentioned there just a moment ago robot wars, robot weapons. And in your manifesto, you talk about mankind entering into a black hole unless it recognizes the dangers implicit in the development of robotic weapons. What is the real danger?
Well, the new kind of weapons which are developed and which will be out in the deployment of the militaries in another 5 to 10 years from now, they would be capable of deciding the targets on their own. And they would just go and hit the targets, and they could make mistakes, and they could start the wars themselves. It's just like today, already in the financial markets, you have algorithms many times taking decisions on behalf of the players. So similarly, you would have these robotic weapons taking decisions on behalf of the human being. So even when the decision makers may not be necessarily wanting to launch a war, the robots would. And that's the danger that we are facing.
It's a horrific snenario.
Yeah, it's absolutely. And if you combine some of the robotic weapons with the nuclear capacity, then you are in for a crisis of survival of the entire humankind in the next decade or two. So, for instance, you have these supersonic missiles which are being developed, and they would fly at the speed of 20 to 30 times the speed of sound. So they would just go from one part of the world to another part of the world in a matter of some minutes. And if they are tipped with nuclear weapons, you have had it. I mean, there is no retreat.
There is a real danger of global war by mistake, in other words.
There is, I think, less by mistake, but more by some kind of a brinksmanship, turning into miscalculations and turning into a war. That's quite likely.
But with intermediate weapons in particular, when the calculation time, the response time is so short, if you think somebody has launched a missile against you, the temptation will always be there to keep your finger on the trigger, and it's a hair trigger.
Yes, exactly. Besides that, the normal nuclear weapons, 2,800 of them are on the hair trigger alert.
Yeah.
This is even without the use of robotics. So 2,800 nuclear weapons can be launched within 5 to 10 minutes of decision being taken. And many of them can hit their targets in the neighborhood in a matter of few minutes. So we are really living on the edge. And we are getting more and more into the abyss. And that is the danger. And that's why we issued the Normandie Manifesto.
Sundeep, you talk to governments about these issues. Do you sense that there's real awareness of the dangers involved here?
Well, interestingly, out of the 193 countries on the roll call of the United Nations, it's only a dozen countries which have nuclear weapons and which have capacity to produce weapons with artificial intelligence, and which are also the biggest spenders of defense expenditure.
Yeah.
So it's not really majority of the countries which are involved in this arms race. It's only 12 to 15 countries which are holding the world for ransom.
You nevertheless remain optimistic, which I find interesting. You say that war is not innate to mankind, although many people might argue otherwise. What gives you this sort of sense of optimism?
Well, war is not innate to human nature. That's what we are saying.
Yeah.
And it's a matter of choice. And if you can make a choice in favor of a war, you can also make a choice against war. For example, we have already decided as humankind, as humanity, as the international community, to abolish certain kinds of weapons. We no longer have landmines. We no longer have certain kinds of cluster munitions.
Yeah.
So there are certain kinds of weapons. There are heavy restrictions on the chemical weapons, biological weapons. So we have consciously decided to limit the use of or even completely abolish certain kinds of weapons. So we are capable of abolishing weaponry. What we need to do is to extend that kind of a mindset to cover all other weapons as well.
But you spoke a short while ago about the dangers of populism and nationalism. Clearly, education is a very important factor in all this. And I know from your own experience in India, many people there may feel tempted to think that they can use a nuclear weapon and get away with it.
Well, interestingly, some parts of Asia are really have really become a dangerous place. In India and our friendly country, Pakistan, it's the elite. I'm not talking about the politicians, but I'm talking about bankers, television anchors, like you are a television anchor, lead television anchors, professors, business executives, the MBAs. Many of them feel that you can just drop the nuclear bomb on the enemy and that would solve a problem. They don't realize what catastrophic consequences it would have for the survival of the humanity.
And does it not occur to them that the enemy might have a nuclear weapon?
Yes, absolutely. And both of them are nuclear armed. Yeah. And the elite on both the countries, especially the professional elite, they think that you can just use nuclear weapon like a toy. Yeah. I must say, to the credit of the political leaders, the formal government leaders, there is a little bit more of a restraint. But not a complete restraint. I mean, the only difference is their signals are more subtle, whereas the professional and the media elite, they are a lot more direct. But we also have a similar story being played out on the other side of Atlantic. Recently, there was a major survey conducted in the United States, and 1/3 of the respondents said that they would support the President of the United States in launching a preemptive attack on North Korea, which would kill 1 million people. So they are happy to see 1 million deaths in a matter of 1 hour, just out of their conviction. And they wouldn't be able to spot North Korea on the map, I'm sure.
Absolutely, yeah. It's extraordinary.
So you see this madness in North Korea, you see this warmongering in India, in Pakistan, And nobody has done surveys in Israel and Iran.
Yeah.
But I won't be surprised if the findings are any different there.
Yeah, we're running out of time, but I just very quickly want to look at your organization's Strategic Foresight Group and the work that it does in seeking to anticipate problems. How do you go about dealing with that? How do you approach governments? What sort of advice, very briefly, do you give them?
Well, basically, we act as a voice of reason. We understand the geopolitical realities, and we understand that it's in the nature of the nation states to aggrandize their interest.
Yeah.
But it's also in the nature of nature states to ensure their survival and survival of their people.
Yeah.
So we have to find pragmatic ways whereby they think their interests are not compromised, but at the same time, they are in a position to serve the greater interest of humankind. And that requires an innovative approach, and that's what we are for. Thank you.
Good luck. Well, thanks very much to our guest, Sundeep Waslekar. That's all we have time for today. But don't go away. More news and headlines to follow soon.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you.
We are journalists, and normally you have to listen to us, but you have things to tell us too. Maybe you've experienced a dramatic event, or you've got something important to say. You want to make a difference. That is why we created The Observers. Now, the first step is very easy. You get in touch with our team. Send us your images, tell us what you've seen. And then it's our job to get your voice out there, on our site, on social networks, on your mobiles and tablets, and on TV, of course. You can appear in our weekly show via webcam. Or perhaps we'll come see you in person, where you live, in your country, your town, and we'll work together on a report for our investigative show, The Observers Direct. So you get the idea. This show is your show, your way to get your voice out to the world.
Liberté, égalité, actualité.